outsiders in general would like to believe that you can create, national identities and strong states, and do it according to all of the norms that are very careful about minority and women's rights and all of these other things, language, being tolerant of diversity and so forth. And unfortunately, I wish this were true, but historically that was just not the way it happened.
Frank, you make a distinction between nation building and state building. Explain the significance of that.
Well, state building is building the visible formal institutions, so courts or government bureaucracies, armies, that sort of thing. Nation building is intangible. It's building a sense of community, tradition, solidarity, a set of symbols that citizens relate to and show some loyalty to. And I think that the two are very much interrelated, because you can't get the formal state institutions to work properly if you don't have a sense of national identity. And that, I think, is one of the problems. You can see this in Iraq today. So the United States invested a huge amount of money rebuilding an army, a police force, court system, finance ministry, all of these visible components of an Iraqi state.
Election and so forth.
Democracy,
bureaus.
right, all of that. But there's no sense of national identity. So you still have three big communities, the Kurds, the Shia, the Sunnis. They all hate each other, they're killing each other. And they have their primary loyalties to those communities and not to something called Iraq.
And so it matters which comes first, and is there a rule that nation building should precede state building, or is it?
No, I don't think.
Is it more difficult than that?
Yeah, it's complicated. They really need to be undertaken in tandem. And one of the big problems, I think, with modern democracy is that the places that have strong national identities didn't acquire them when they were democracies. They acquired them in a pre-democratic era where you could just conquer a territory and basically tell the inhabitants, you have to speak this language or you have to observe this kind of religious practice. And those national identities were shaped, if you think about Germany, German national identity came together in the 19th century with the ingathering of all the Germans scattered over Central and Eastern Europe, and it had to be done by a Bismarck who basically did it militarily.
And the same with Italy.
Same with Italy, and I mean basically...
Only not as successfully, I suppose.
Not as successfully, but basically all of the modern state unit, and some of them like Japan and China, it happened so many centuries ago that no one remembers how bloody that process was. So I think this is one of the great areas of amnesia of modern societies, that they all went through this nation-building process. Violence was an important component of it, and they've all managed to kind of suppress the memory of how violent that process was.
And the United Nations presumably doesn't contribute to overcoming that amnesia.
No. And in fact, outsiders in general would like to believe that you can create, national identities and strong states, and do it according to all of the norms that are very careful about minority and women's rights and all of these other things, language, being tolerant of diversity and so forth. And unfortunately, I wish this were true, but historically that was just not the way it happened.
Now, you also have alluded to your distinction between the three components of liberal democracy: the state apparatus itself, the rule of law, and democratic accountability, as you call it. Now, and you say about those that sequencing is important, that it matters a great deal.
That's right.
Explain that.
Well, so I believe in democracy, and I hate, to make this observation, but in many countries where democracy has preceded the creation of a modern state, it's had bad consequences. And so there's a further definition that's important, which is the difference between what Max Weber called a patrimonial state and a modern state. patrimonial state is a state where the state apparatus is a species of private property of the rulers. So a king used to be able to just give away a province to a daughter as a wedding present because he owned his territory. And a modern state is not that. There's a clear distinction between public and private. The state serves the public interest, not the private interest of the rulers, and it tries to treat citizens as citizens impersonally, not because they're friends or relatives of the ruler. And that making that transition is an extremely difficult one for many countries. In Germany, in China, in Japan, in certain countries with modern states, that transition was a result of military competition. There's nothing like the existential threat of being invaded and slaughtered to get you serious about promoting people on the basis of merit, to get rid of all these incompetent cousins and to essentially create the framework for a modern state. And where that didn't happen and you had democracy early, there's a tendency to fill the state apparatus basically with your cousins or friends or supporters, and that's what political scientists call patronage or clientelism. And that's actually the reality in very many democratic countries around the world.
Now, you talk about the sequencing between the creation of the state apparatus and democracy. What about the rule of law?
Well, the rule of law is also critical, and I think one of the great advantages that European countries had over other parts of the world was that actually law was the first thing that was put into place. European law, either the common law in England or the civil law in the European continent, preceded both state building and democracy by centuries. So the common law really originated out of the law of the King's Court after the Norman Conquest in England. In Europe, it was the result of something called the investiture conflict that took place basically in the 11th century. So it was a long time ago, and that established a tradition of independent courts. It put limits on what rulers could do. So the Holy Roman Emperor couldn't just invade another country because that country had rights that he had to respect and so forth. And so it moderated dictatorship. And that's in sharp contrast to a place like China that never had a tradition of law and in which emperors had much more absolute authority to essentially do as they wished. So that actually led to a very different pattern of development where you had deeply rooted law in Europe that put limits on dictatorship and then created the basis for the expansion of democracy in the last couple of centuries.
Now, one of the oddities of most modernization theories is that they take Europe as a kind of model, and they leave out other inconvenient parts of the world or eras of history. So America rarely figures in these accounts, but the Greeks and Romans, I mean, the world of classical antiquity also usually is left aside as a kind of inconvenient complication. Now, to some extent, you also leave aside, you don't leave aside America, you talk a lot about America, which we're coming to, but you also put the Greeks and the Romans aside. You do mention them, of course, and you do talk about them a little bit, but they're not central to your argument. How do you defend that?
It was a deliberate choice. So I was a classics major when I was an undergraduate, so I learned Greek and Latin, and I've spent a lot of time dealing with that. But I think part of the reason was that I wanted to get a little bit away from this classic Whig history, that begins with Greece and Rome and goes through the Magna Carta and the Glorious Revolution and sort of sees the progress of mankind as basically the progress of England, as the English liberals saw themselves. The other thing was that I actually think that modern states are very important. And the one thing that the Greeks and Romans really never developed was a modern state. They never had a kind of bureaucratic, impersonal, uniform state that they were able to use to impose law on large populations. And this is, just a historical point that I think that has not been recognized in Western scholarship, that the first society to really create a modern state was China. Mm-hmm. And in my argument, this was done in the 3rd century BC. They had a bureaucratic, centralized, merit-based state system that was quite impersonal, and I think they were the first ones to do it. And so it was a little bit of a, an effort to correct what I think is a somewhat skewed understanding of global modernization.
Well, and of course, if the Greeks and Romans are admitted to the party, then the story isn't modernization. As such, since you begin with some form of high degree of political development,
yes,
after all, one in which politics really rules economics, mm-hmm. In a way in which it doesn't seem to happen in the modern world in anything like that form. But is that history inconvenient for that reason, that it is so heavily political, and economic and social factors play a much lower role in development?
No, I don't think so. I actually have vague ambitions at some point to, there's one big hole, I think, in my argument that a number of my friends have pointed out, which is that I don't really talk about the Republican form of government, mm-hmm. Which was certainly, a precedent that was created by the Greeks and Romans, and something that was deeply important to the founding fathers in, mm-hmm. in the American story. And it's a lack. I plead guilty to that, and it's one that I actually want to fill, because the story of republicanism in the ancient world is actually a very, very complex one, and one that's still, I think, is relevant to our American story.
And the story of and civic virtue too. I mean, those concepts don't. When you talk about democratic accountability, that's really not a discussion of citizen virtue, although one could say it covers the same ground in a way.
I'm not sure that I made this point in that second volume, but I certainly believe that virtue remains, critical to the success of a democracy. It is
and
less.
How do you define that virtue that is critical to democracy?
Well, I think it requires basically a certain kind of public spiritedness. So, mm-hmm. if citizens do not pay attention to politics, if they don't, take part in debates, if they don't vote, if they don't actually care about the nature of public policy, then democratic system is not going to work very well. And I think that, the way our system has evolved, it's different from a classical Republican political order, because in a sense we kind of relaxed that requirement. We have a kind of commercial republic where people are encouraged to pursue private life. We don't teach civics. We don't make citizenship a kind of center of people's beings. And so I think some of our problems are actually traceable to the fact that we don't actually require the kind of level of virtue that a Republican form of government would have demanded.
You didn't have high school civics?
I think I did, but I was in high school in the 1960s, and I think things have changed a lot.
I had it in the 1970s. They still had it.
Yeah.
It wasn't very good, but
No.
they still taught it.
But it's shocking, if you look at polls about how much American, students know about their own form of government. I mean, it's terrible. And you can't be a citizen if you basically don't know, what the Constitution says about, the structure of the American system and the like.
No, of course not. Of course not. Now, you do talk, as I said, a lot about America, and applying these three categories of state law and democratic accountability to America. You have the interesting diagnosis that in America, democracy came before state building. And that has
law and democracy.
Law and democracy came before state building, and that has been a disadvantage to us in the long run. Why do you think that?
I think that you actually need a balance in a political system. So the state is really about power. The state, and that's why people don't like the state.
Mm-hmm.
The state is about generating power and being able to use that power to enforce laws, defend the community, provide for public security, deliver services, create things that people want out of government. The other two parts of the tripod, law and democracy, properly understood, are constraints on power.
Mm-hmm.
So the rule of law, if it's really going to be the rule of law, has to apply to the most powerful people, the president, members of Congress. And of course, accountability is also a limitation. It forces the government to respond to the interests of the whole community,
Mm-hmm.
not just their own self-interest. And in my view, it's not a comfortable mating of these very different kinds of forces, where one wants to increase power and the other two want to limit power. And I think you get bad outcomes if you're too far in either direction.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously, if you don't have instruments of constraint, you're basically like China today, a dictatorship. But I think the American tendency has been to focus on the constraining institutions at the expense of the power institution. And as a result, we get, I think, less than optimal results in our public policies a lot of times.
And is that because you think they're too populist?
In certain ways, in fact, I think I've said this at some point, that we actually have, it's not just populist in the sense of too much democracy, but I think we also have too much law.
Mm-hmm.
So I can give you a couple of examples of this. I mean, you just look at enforcement of laws. In most European parliamentary democracies, laws are enforced by the state. The legislature makes a rule about environment or employment opportunity, and then the justice ministry or some state ministry then is responsible for enforcing it. In our country, because of the deep-rooted legal tradition, when Congress created a lot of new social policies in the 1960s and 70s, they gave standing to private individuals to basically enforce the law. So they can sue the government to force the government either to do something or to stop it from doing something. And that's the reason we cannot do an infrastructure project in the United States in less than about 15 years. Because the moment that the Corps of Army Engineers announces a bridge or a tunnel, they're immediately slapped with half a dozen lawsuits from all sorts of groups that have some problem with it. And we don't handle this administratively. We put it through a very long, slow legal process.
Mm-hmm. Well, we want to turn in the final segment to talk about your analysis of America more expansively, and we look forward to that.
All right.